The government starts the parliamentary year chalking up wins on tax and industrial relations as the coalition shifts to a new fight in the climate wars, utes. I'm David Spears. Welcome to Insiders. The first week of Parliament for the year began with the coalition signing up to the government's Stage 3 tax changes. It wasn't thrilled about it, but had little choice. And the Prime Minister relished in the discomfort of his opponents. The fight may not be over, though. Peter Dutton is vowing to go to the election with a significant tax reform plan of his own. The government's victory on Stage 3 was quickly followed by a deal with the Greens and key crossbenchers on workplace relations. Along with greater rights for casuals, truckies and delivery riders, the changes will mean workers can refuse to answer emails, calls and text messages after hours without facing punishment. Unions are thrilled, businesses alarmed at what they say is another unnecessary dead weight on the economy.
Federal Parliament resumes tomorrow for 2024 with the revamped Stage 3 tax cuts centre stage.
Good to be back.
Yeah, I'm jumping up and down about it, mate.
Stage 3?
Stage 3 tax cuts, who'd have thought it?
Oh, we'll see what happens. Parliament's always interesting, isn't it?
The coalition officially backed the Albanese government's tax changes.
Not to support the Prime Minister's lie, but to support those families who need help now.
This is ultimately putting a band-aid on a bullet wound.
We will take to the next election a significant tax policy.
The first day of Parliament did lay the foundations for an election, one eventually fought on taxes and the truth.
Will the Prime Minister rule out changing the current tax treatment of the family home?
And it has nothing to do with what we're doing.
Will the Treasurer rule out any changes to the current tax treatment of negative gearing?
Asking for details about things that are only happening in his head, Mr. Speaker.
Isn't every Australian worse off as a result of your broken promises?
Here's Peter!
Here's Johnny!
Why, of all the Jack Nicholson movies, I picked The Shining. It couldn't be a few good men, Mr. Speaker.
You can't handle the truth.
This is question time, not the Academy Awards.
Federal Parliament appears set to pass new laws granting a right to switch off.
Today is a good day for casuals. Someone who's not being paid 24 hours a day shouldn't be penalised if they're not online and available.
Nobody has ever spoken to me in the 10 years I've been in and out of politics about phone calls after hours.
I think this is really, a triumph of stupidity over common sense.
The laws inadvertently legislated criminal penalties for employers that don't follow the rules.
Can you guarantee that employers won't face criminal penalties?
No, this is the Liberals' penalties that they insisted on yesterday.
And at the 11th hour, it is not our job to fix their mess.
So government will move our own legislation to fix this issue, but it's up to the Liberal Party to explain why it is. Thanks very much.
And my guest this morning is the Shadow Treasurer Angus Taylor. First, let's check what's making news. The Associated Press reports Israeli airstrikes overnight have killed at least 44 people, including more than a dozen children in the southern Gaza city of Rafah. It comes just hours after Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said he'd asked the military to prepare for a ground invasion there. More than half of Gaza's 2.3 million people are packed into Rafah, having fled other parts of the territory. Back here, the Nine newspapers report more than 65% of federal politicians own 2 or more properties as Greens and crossbenchers seek to put negative gearing reform back on the agenda. Independent Senator David Pocock says MPs own a stunning amount of property compared to the average Australian, and it's hard to believe this doesn't skew their perspective on generous tax concessions. And one from Sam Maiden on news.com.au. Independent Senator Lydia Thorpe has accused the Prime Minister of a sexist double standard over his reaction to a video of Barnaby Joyce lying on a Canberra footpath late at night. Anthony Albanese said it was a matter for the Nationals frontbencher to explain. When video previously emerged of Senator Thorpe engaged in a verbal clash outside a nightclub, the Prime Minister said it was unacceptable and urged her to get some support. Senator Thorpe says sexism, misogyny and racism still plague our politics. We're going to start this morning with the contest over tax that dominated the first week of Parliament. The benefits for taxpayers won't flow until July, but there's already been a political dividend for Labor. Its confidence has returned. On the policy front, Labor's convinced it's now boxed in the coalition. Going back to anything like the original Stage 3 would be costly and potentially unpopular, but perhaps the coalition will be brave. Perhaps they'll go to the election with a significant tax reform plan, as Peter Dutton's suggesting. I'll ask Angus Taylor about that shortly. First, let's see what the panel makes of it. We're joined this week by Jacob Grieber, Claire Armstrong and Tom Crowley. Very good morning to all of you. Jacob, let's start with the coalition's decision. I don't think anyone was terribly surprised to back in the changes on tax at the start of the week. But was there much internal debate? Was there any serious pushback within the coalition at this decision?
Oh, I don't think they did it with any great joy or willingness. It's clearly been a difficult decision for them internally. There were those who are saying stick to the guns on this issue, but Dutton, I think, and the rest of his team recognise this is a tactical retreat for them. The thought of them defending this in the middle of a cost of living crisis is pretty tough, but they've tried to sort of build this expectation that we'll do this, but we'll go back to our sort of knitting later on with a tax reform package. Yeah, and I want to come to that, Claire. There were a few Liberals who wanted to stand and fight on this, oppose what the government's doing, but the overwhelming majority agreed that you got to back in more relief for low and middle income earners, as much as they might be uncomfortable in agreeing to this. How do you think Peter Dutton went in explaining the position they landed on?
I think, as you say, the fact that there were only a handful, and not even publicly, that came out and said they should stand their ground, says that Dutton, it actually says more to the control that Dutton has over the party room at the moment. And I think the fact that we saw the Prime Minister come out and say afterwards that I suppose in the 2 weeks since the decision, you didn't have this carousel of Liberal or Nationals MPs coming out and saying that they should stand their ground. The PM tried to say, well, if you vote yes for this, if you have any integrity, you should vote no because you should stick to your position, because he was trying to push that wedge in because it didn't have a public effect. So I think
he would have loved a long-running
of
fight
course
over this, right?
And I think that Dutton, he took a very pragmatic approach and looked at it and said, well, it's happening either way. And they've gone back to this principle of, well, we're never going to stand in the way of lower taxes for anyone. And and obviously the promise of more to come is clearly what settled the party.
And it's clearly aimed at showing that he still believes in the principles of the original Stage 3. He's talking about, as you say, going to the election with something more that is in keeping with those principles.
We will take to the next election a significant tax policy which will reduce taxes for Australian taxpayers, because we know that there is going to be a lot of support needed to help Australian families recover from this period of Labor.
So, Tom, the prospect of a significant or serious tax reform plan from the coalition at the election means we'll have an election debate over tax reform, which will be interesting. What do you think is likely here? How far can the coalition realistically go?
Well, it's going to be interesting. I mean, if the starting point, as we've heard in the last week or so, is that they're going to restore the remaining bits of Stage 3, we know that costs about $40 billion over the forward estimates period. And that is, just to put it in pure electoral arithmetic, John Howard-style arithmetic, that is a lot of money to take into an election bottom line. It's a $40 billion election goodie bag for Labor to spend and have the same sort of bottom line that they take to the election. So I think it's interesting. I mean, I can understand this week why Peter Dutton and Angus Taylor have wanted to defend the principle of that 37% tax bracket, and Andrew Bragg, Julian Leeser, a couple of others have stuck their neck out and say, no, we should be ideologically committed to getting rid of that tax bracket. I do wonder, though, whether, electorally that's going to make sense to Peter Dutton, or whether they might want to frame something that's maybe a little bit less expensive to take to the next election.
Yeah, I guess this goes to the level of ambition, the willingness to really have a fight over this. We hear from Peter Dutton and Angus Taylor talk about, they're up for a debate about some serious tax reform. But, Jacob, the last two opposition leaders who tried to do tax reform from opposition, Bill Shorten, John Hewson, didn't work out terribly well for them. What do you think in terms of the level of ambition we're likely to see?
Well, I mean, both of those opposition leaders you mentioned took some pretty ambitious stuff to the election and failed. So we're not talking about that. So I don't think we're in that realm. And I think, to go to your point, Tom, this is This is ground for the coalition to make hay on, because we're talking about a tax bracket that will increasingly capture a lot of younger millennials. Right at the moment, when they're trying to pay for these overpriced houses in this country, they're looking at a kind of a big disincentive coming down the pipe at them. So there's politics to be played around that issue, and I think the coalition, that's what their thinking is, because they're also of the view that these tax cuts do flow to lower income earners, but they're really quite small, especially in the context of how much prices have gone up. You know, this is a drop in the ocean of relief for the sort of inflation that everyone's dealing with.
I mean, tax reform is one of these words that, you know, means what everyone wants it to mean. But I think it's interesting that there's sort of two problems that Australia needs to fix with its tax base, one of which is the over-reliance on taxing incomes and workers. And as you say, Jacob, I think that as we have an ageing population and we have a shrinking, you know, working population base, that's going to mean that my generation is going to be taking a lot greater burden of the tax sharing, tax raising. But the other problem is that we also don't seem to be raising enough revenue over the long term to deliver what governments say that they want to deliver in terms of social services. So the full tax reform conversation is, on the one hand, how can we move away from reliance on income tax, but where else can we get the money? Is it the GST, is it assets? And that becomes really politically difficult. I'm not sure I see either party willing to take that full conversation and the unpopularity of that full conversation.
Oh, I was just going to say that I think it's interesting Labor really want to talk about the losers of, well, they don't want to talk about the losers of stage 3, but when they're looking at people who have less, they're looking at the $180,000 to $200,000 income tax bracket. But in reality, there are a lot of young people who have maybe first, second, third year into a career on that $110,000 a year who were looking at quite a long working period of being in the same 30% tax bracket. And now obviously at 135, they'll go to that 37%. That would be, I presume, where there's votes to be gained potentially for any party, because an income of $100,000 when you've got the HEX bill behind you isn't as much as it sounds like.
No, it's a very good point. In the meantime, while the coalition waits to see what the books look like and what it can do at the election, it's trying to put as much heat as it can on the government over what else it's going to do. Negative gearing in particular has been a focus this week. Government, as we know, and we heard the PM on this program last week, being cautious about saying no plans, you know, we're not considering any negative gearing change. Labor, of course, did take a negative gearing change to the 2019 election. But the man who was in charge of that, Bill Shorten, was perhaps the most emphatic on the Labor side this week about not going back there.
We're not doing it. I did take a policy to restrict some of the aspects of it to the 2019 election. I have learnt my lesson. I take tax reform to the election and all we got at the end of it was Scott Morrison.
That was a good line.
Somewhat burnt. Yeah. But I mean, that's all good and well, but it's not policy until it is policy.
Yeah.
That's what we discovered
as we saw with the stage 3 changes.
Right.
Well,
Looking
it's
at
not an election promise until you're leading up to the next election to seek a mandate either. So, as in, it's not a broken promise.
But that would, and if they took something to the election, then, you know, fair enough. That's what John Howard did on the GST as well. Negative gearing, though, it's a really interesting debate that's kind of prized open a little this week. You've got the Greens and crossbenchers trying to prize it open even more. Is it working? Is negative gearing doing what we're told it's meant to do?
Well, I mean, I think negative gearing has come to be this sort of great white symbol of everything that's wrong in the housing market, at least when you speak to some people in my age cohort. I think we probably put a little bit too much on it for all of that. I think actually, generally, when you look at the evidence in terms of its effect on housing supply, on rents, on house prices, it's pretty small change, really. I think, you know, the Prime Minister said last week, oh, it's helping housing supply. I think that's generally not the case because a lot of negative gearing happens on existing properties.
What about the argument it's keeping rents down?
Well, yeah, it creates more rental properties, but it creates more renters because the investors are also, you know, pushing prospective home buyers back into the rental market. So I think generally the last time that negative gearing was floated, again, as Bill Shorten said there, it was rolling back only parts of negative gearing.
Yeah,
so
the Labor
didn't apply retrospectively.
his idea was you grandfather existing investments, but then you can only negative gear newly built properties.
That's right. And I think when the analysis was done on that by Treasury, by Grattan and others, the effect on house prices was pretty small. The effect on rents was pretty small. So, I think it's really more of a revenue-raising measure, frankly, than it is a housing market measure. It has that politics of, housing, which has become such a significant generational divide and such a significant political issue. So I think it'd be very interesting to see how it would play out in an election campaign, but I don't think it's really a game changer.
I think, you can talk about the policy merits around negative gearing, and some of it does look like it's not fit for purpose. The problem politically for Labor is what we're seeing is they're getting dragged to the left on these tax policy changes. That's certainly the case with stage 3. It was unthinkable for them to get to the middle part of this year with a tax cut the way it was set up, going to higher income earners who also earn more income, so they got most of the tax cut. But politically that was untenable. They've rolled on that, delivered, got back to what they wanted. The negative gearing thing is kind of similar. They're worried about the left. They're worried about the Greens hitting them on this. And, you see it today with Pocock questioning the number of politicians with investment properties. So they're worried about being wedged there on their left flank.
I don't know. I would agree with that, except I would say I don't know if they're being dragged. I think they're dragging the political conversation to where they want it to be. I don't think there was no one in the Labor Party room kicking and screaming at the actual mechanics of the stage 3 changes. There was nervousness around breaking a promise and how that would be communicated, but no one stuck their hand up in caucus and said, "Oh, I think we've gone a bit too far."
Would there be appetite on negative gearing, do you think?
I think it's this. You have the same core group of agitators in that caucus. They're the ones that front run on changes to the job seeker rate and other kind of issues like that. That's a pretty foundational part of the party. The issue, I think, is actually the history of this policy, and we know from elections past that it's there's a lot of ads that I'm sure that could just be reheated from a few years ago, which is the fear.
Well, yeah, but I think the reason that we keep ending up here is because housing is the economic issue for Gen Z and millennial voters. It is the only game in town. It is everything that everyone my age talks about. And that's, at the moment, the policy fight has largely played out between Labor and the Greens over renters. The Coalition may have some things to say about that 37% tax bracket. I know they might revive housing for super. They're going to want to have something to say on this issue as well. I just think it is an enormous electoral issue for a voting bloc that's getting bigger and bigger, and they're not getting into houses, and so they're not getting any less angry.
Well, it's a good point at which to talk to the Shadow Treasurer Angus Taylor now. And perhaps before we do that, what is negative gearing? A quick little explainer for you. It allows an investor to buy a rental property with borrowed money and then deduct the losses. So if the interest payments are higher than the rental returns, investors can use the loss to reduce their personal income tax bill all the time while the property is steadily growing in value. Just over 1 million Australians have a negatively geared investment, according to Treasury, providing them a tax benefit of around $2.7 billion. It's often blamed, as we were discussing, for locking young buyers out of the market. And Bill Shorten, of course, did promise to limit negative gearing at the 2019 election. Since then, Labor hasn't been prepared to touch it. A handful of Liberals over the years have also backed some sort of reform.
Things like negative gearing should be looked at. I mean, I'm not saying advocating one way or another, but what I would say is governments should always look at what's in front of them.
Negative gearing should be skewed towards new housing, so there is an incentive to add to the housing stock rather than an incentive to speculate on existing property.
Angus Taylor, welcome to the program.
Good to be with you, David.
So why shouldn't negative gearing be limited to just newly built housing stock, as even Joe Hockey suggested back then?
Well, thanks for having me, David. But look, the simple point about this is we won't support changes to negative gearing. And the reason is that we don't want to see more competition in the housing market coming from industry super funds and international investment funds, which is what would happen if Labor had their way. That's their intent. We know they're considering this. Their answers in the Parliament on this this week were very wishy-washy. They were all over the place. But more competition in the housing market from international investment funds and industry super funds is not the answer. The answer is we do have to have an alignment between housing supply and immigration. We've already announced that we've recommitted to superannuation for housing. It was a policy, of course, we took to the last election. It was a popular policy.
Accessing your super.
Yeah, exactly, which you were talking about a moment ago. And these are important policies, and we'll have more to say about this. We completely accept this is a really big deal for so many Australians. It is amongst younger Australians, and I see it with my own kids, a top line issue. We're focused on it, but taking away negative gearing is.
All right, so that's a no. Ruling out any negative gearing change. You've been asking the government all week to rule out negative gearing and other things. So just to go through a few other options, capital gains tax, trusts. You're not going to touch those either?
Well, David, again, we'll announce all our election policies before the election, but we're not proposing to go down those paths.
Sounds
Look,
like the government's
let me be clear. We are absolutely committed to lower, simpler, fairer taxes. Right. We are absolutely committed to a back-to-basics economic agenda. We've seen a collapse in disposable incomes of Australians. We haven't seen in my lifetime on a sustained basis. 8.6%, $8,000 for the average Australian. I mean, I'm seeing people in food banks around this country I've never witnessed before, and they all say this. It has to be about getting the economy to work again, and the last 18 months has been disastrous with rising prices, 12 interest rate increases and 27% increase in personal income taxes being paid.
Well, just on that, well, I've heard you use that line. That's because more people are working, isn't it? The only tax change the government's made is the one you're supporting.
No, absolutely not. I mean, it's far more than that. We're seeing bracket creep working its ugly magic. It is the thief in the night, and it takes from Australians pay packets without them noticing until they see there's less in their bank account. That's one of the functions of inflation, where wages haven't been able to keep up, and they haven't. We've also seen Limedo, of course, going. So there's been a very significant increase in taxes being paid. And many Australians, some whom will be watching this program, will have noticed they didn't get money back in their tax return last year that they had in previous years.
So just coming back to the question, though, about capital gains tax and trusts, I think you said you're not proposing to touch those.
No.
But do you rule it out? Because this is a demand you're making of the other side. Do you rule out?
We'll take our... Look, we are for lower, simpler, fairer taxes. But David, here's the point. Labor took to the last election promises that they didn't keep. On electricity prices, $275. We've heard it so many times before the election, 92 times from the Prime Minister. We didn't hear afterwards. Stage 3 tax cuts, a calculated lie. We now know that. We are not... But this is important, Dave. We're not going to make that mistake. What we take to the election, we will do. There's been too much loss of trust between Australians and leaders across politics, business, media, and it's our job to re-establish that trust. The breach of trust, the egregious breach of trust we've seen, and betrayal we've seen from Labor in recent weeks with their calculated lies, is not the way through. So we will work our way through our policies. They will be focused on lower, simpler, fairer taxes, on tax reform, in keeping with the Stage 3 tax cuts.
What about the GST? Would you touch that?
Look, again, David, raising the GST is certainly not my focus, and it's not going to be something that we'll be doing work on. But I tell you what we will be doing is taking strong tax policies like some we've already announced. We've already said that small business should have access to the same accelerated depreciation arrangements that they had prior to COVID. I mean, this is enormously important. We have to get our economy working again. There's no amount of redistribution you can do that makes up for the $8,000 that the average Australian has lost, and the $20,000 or $30,000 that many Australian families have lost.
I've heard that point.
Who have mortgages.
Okay.
Yeah, you've got to get the economy working, and only Liberals understand that. That's about mobilising workplaces, mobilising businesses, getting people out there,
but on tax,
aspiring.
Just on tax, you've been getting into the government all week because they on negative gearing say we have no plans to touch it, and yet on the GST, capital gains tax and trusts, you've used very similar language.
Well, let's look at what the government has been doing. We know from Stephen Kennedy this week, he spoke, of course, on Friday, that the government, Treasury, was working on these tax changes for a long time. We know that.
But I'm asking about your position.
And so
you're not ruling out these things.
We haven't got a Treasury doing that kind of work. So it's right and proper that we ask what they're doing.
Okay.
Now, we have every indication that they've been looking at negative gearing. And let me tell you something about what we've seen this week. We support tax relief because at the end of the day, the failed management of the economy from Labor means Australians deserve better. The real problem with what Labor has proposed here is that they're funding that tax relief by breaching a promise that they made over 100 times. And we want them to lay out the options that they considered. Why is it that they chose a funding model for this tax relief that involved such a breach of trust?
Well, you promised to keep those stage 3 tax cuts too, of course, and now you're supporting.
No, we're not. This is the important point. This is the point I was making. We support the tax relief not because that's the very best option. The best option is to manage the economy properly, but because after 18 months of failed management by Labor, Australians are hurting badly for all the reasons I've explained.
So because of the circumstances
what we don't support is funding that through a betrayal of the Australian people and broken promises. Now, the question is, what options did Labor look at in this process? On your show, Anthony Albanese said he had released all the documentation. That is clearly not true, another lie. Well, give us the options. What were the other options that Labor looked at in the course of this process?
In terms of where you now go on tax reform, you've said strong tax reform you'll take to the election. You want to keep in the principle of those original stage 3 cuts. What are those principles you'd like to keep?
Well, the first principle is deliver on what you say. And I don't say that lightly, David. I mean, the erosion of trust I've seen in recent years for leadership in every domain of Australian society is, I think, terrifying for the implications for our future. So we've got to get that trust back. That's incumbent on you, on me, on everybody else. The second principle is lower, simpler, fairer taxes. We believe in that firmly as a Liberal Party. That's why we've had fights over tax policy in the 2013 election, the 2019 election, the most recent election, of course. We'll continue to take up the torch on lower, simpler, fairer taxes. Fighting bracket creep, rewarding aspiration and hard work. I mean, these are hugely important principles, not dividing Australians unnecessarily. These are the principles that will give us that strong economy, low inflation economy that we need, and the economy that can actually deliver for Australians again, as Labor has failed over the last 18 months.
You've previously committed to undoing Labor's change on superannuation. They've reduced the tax break for bigger accounts, those with $3 million or more in their super. I think that's going to cost you around $2 billion a year. Is that still a commitment, or does that go into the mix of what you more broadly want to do now?
No, that's absolutely. We've made that. We've made that commitment.
So whatever you do is on top of that.
Well, of course, and we haven't seen. Obviously, the budget will come in May. No doubt Labor's going to want to spend a lot more money. I mean, as soon as they see some money, they spend it. That's what Labor does. And that's the challenge, of course, is finding the money as Labor keeps spending it. They've spent an extra $209 billion since they came to power, David. That's $20,000 for every Australian household, and there's no sign of that stopping. So we'll have to work within the budget constraints that Labor creates as they spend the money as they always do.
So just a final one on tax, and I guess this is a question about ambition, really. We mentioned earlier that opposition's trying to take big tax reform to elections. We've seen not so successful John Hewson, Bill Shorten, and so on. Are we looking at sweeping tax reform, serious tax reform that you'll take to the election, or is it going to be more tokenistic?
Well, we are very ambitious to get the economy back on track. You just can't have a hit of that scale, unprecedented in our lifetimes. We can't take a hit of that scale to Australian standard of living. And whilst Labor thinks the answer is to just move money around to change the slices of the pie, the answer is actually to get back to basics.
So you're up for a serious reform.
Well, and whether it's industrial relations, where we've opposed the government's position, whether it's competition policy, where all we've seen from Labor is crony capitalism, whether it's aligning immigration with housing supply. I mean, these are all crucial issues.
But you are on tax willing to do something big. You could even look at the GST. You've left that open.
No, honestly, David, raising the GST in the middle of a cost of living crisis is not something that a Liberal's going to support. I mean, let's be clear.
So you won't go to the election with any change on GST?
Don't put words on that sort of thing. But that's obviously not going to be a focus. Look, if Labor wants to raise the GST, they should be clear.
No, I'm asking. Just to be clear for viewers, that's not on the table.
So in the middle of a cost of living crisis, your focus has to be on bringing prices of things down, not up. Right. And that will be our focus over the next months as we bring together our policies.
Let me ask you about industrial relations. The government's latest changes passed through the Senate. The coalition's been sharply critical throughout all of this, whether it's the right to disconnect, whether it's the multi-employer bargaining. Will you roll it all back?
We'll certainly take a targeted package of repeals to the next election. There's no question about that. We're opposing the legislation. We've been unambiguous in that position. And I tell you why, David, we've seen behind that collapse in living standards is an unprecedented collapse in labour productivity in this country. This is not the sort of the grinding challenge the world has had with productivity over many years. This is a collapse of 6.1% in labour productivity in the last 18 months. Now, if that's the case, people can't be paid more on a sustainable basis. This is an important part of the reason why standards of living have collapsed. We have to get back on track here. And the key to that is to get employers and employees working together to make their workplaces more prosperous, more productive, more competitive, and not to put union officials in the middle to try and impose their views of the world. We've got to get our workplaces back to that focus on.
So what would you
on a prosperous?
What would you undo? I mean, the right to disconnect.
Well, obviously, and you know,
and multi-employer bargaining.
Peter Dutton has said that in the last hour or so.
Multi-employer bargaining too.
Well, and there's aspects of that piece of legislation that are unacceptable. But I'm not going to preempt Michaelia Cash, who will bring forward those policies. And as always, with our policies, and I'll emphasise this, we want to do things that are achievable. And that we're going to remain committed to. We're not going to do what Labor has done. Getting things through the Senate on industrial relations is always hard, so it will be a targeted package, and it has to be.
Vehicle emissions standard. The government unveiled its long-awaited plans earlier in the week. You've labelled them a ute tax. We know at least some of your colleagues previously supported a vehicle emissions standard, but I think the criticism here is about the model that's been put forward by the government. Can you just clarify for us, is it that level of ambition in the government's plan, or is it the very idea of a vehicle emissions standard that you oppose?
Now, what we oppose is anything that's going to increase the price of the most popular cars in Australia. That's what we oppose. And it's a very similar point to your question on the GST. In the middle of a cost of living crisis, you don't impose a policy that's going to increase the cost of living for Australians.
But you could have a standard with a less ambitious trajectory. Is that?
You know what? If it's not going to increase or distort the pricing, so what's the point? And look, Chris Bowen here, this is the minister who said he was going to get electricity prices down by $275. We're not seeing any sign of that. This will increase the price of vehicles, and you only have to look at the documentation.
Some vehicles, maybe not.
Well, the most popular vehicles in Australia are the Hilux and the Ranger, and if any vehicle prices are going to go up, it's going to be those. Let's be clear about that. And if you look at the documentation carefully, you will see there's penalty provisions that they're proposing of $100 per gram kilometre, David. Now, for a Hilux and a Ranger, that is a very significant penalty. And the idea that customers won't end up paying that, you've got to be kidding. I mean, and we've seen this in other markets, like New Zealand.
The government says it won't drive up prices.
Chris Bowen says it won't. And how credible is he after what he took to the last election?
On renewables more generally, the Nationals are now saying halt the rollout of renewables in the regions. Do you agree?
Well, it's very clear that the 28,000 kilometres of transmission lines and all that goes with it is having huge impacts on our regions, and we have to get it back under control.
But do you back the Nats in saying?
Well, I do say that there's been overreach by Labor. There's no question about that.
But you're not going that far.
I'm just saying there's been overreach. We'll take our policies, as always, to the next election, and we'll make sure they're policies we can keep. As always, with any projects, there's good projects and bad projects, but 28,000 kilometres of transmission lines and a big loss of prime agricultural land that we're starting to see right across Australia. We think there's a better way. Ted O'Brien is working away on this. We've already said quite a lot about energy policy in recent times, and we'll continue to.
Look, just a final one. Barnaby Joyce, as you know, was filmed lying on a footpath after Parliament had risen the other night. Are you comfortable with the explanations he's given for this, or does this raise a concern for you about standards of behaviour?
Look, people love to jump to conclusions on these things, and I'm certainly not doing that, and I don't think anyone should. I think the primary issue for us is Barnaby's welfare, and we will remain focused on that. I certainly will remain focused on that.
When you say that, is he okay?
Well, he clearly wasn't at the time, so that's something that we're going to focus on, and we should focus on. That's always got to be the focus when these sorts of things happen. But the jumping to conclusions we've seen, David, it's a bit of a habit in the modern world. I see that, but it's not appropriate.
You'd say the same if it was a Labor.
I think jumping to conclusions on any of these things, we've seen too much of that lately.
Angus Taylor, thanks so much for joining us this morning.
Good on you, David.
Coming up, we're going to dive into those industrial relations changes we were just talking about there, the package that passed through the Senate, including that right to disconnect. That certainly got a lot of business groups very concerned. First, we're going to continue with this conversation and back to our panel. We are joined once again by Jacob Griever, Claire Armstrong and Tom Crowley. Look, just on Barnaby Joyce, I understand he is telling colleagues that he's on a medication. You're not meant to drink with the medication that he's on. He was drinking at a parliamentary function, felt fine when he left, but later on the dizziness kicked in and this was the result. He was videoed, filmed lying on the footpath there, talking on the phone to his wife, Vicky Campion, but Lydia Thorpe has now weighed into this as well, as I mentioned earlier, telling Sam Maiden there's a double standard here in the way the Prime Minister's responded to this. PM has said this is a matter for Barnaby Joyce, but he was quite critical of Senator Thorpe, when she was filmed outside a strip club in a verbal clash. Jacob, what do you think? Does Lydia Thorpe have a point there about how the PM's responded to this, and what about Barnaby Joyce? Are there more answers needed here?
I think Lydia does have a point here, and to go to what Angus Taylor said, people do rush to judgment on these things. I don't think anyone wants to see the former Deputy Prime Minister of this country, and a man who clearly wants that job again in that state. When you are a politician, you forfeit certain rights to privacy, especially in an era where everyone's got an iPhone. But we don't know the circumstances, and at the end of the day, politicians are human beings, and I think you've got to be careful on this front.
Yeah. Claire, what do you think?
I think it's not knowing the circumstances that means that everyone else has to be pretty careful about how they talk about this, which you could argue that maybe the Prime Minister was not when he immediately responded to the situation with Lydia and said that she should get support. A comment like that could be said of anyone, Barnaby included, but it wasn't. So I think as much as, even if you set aside the specifics of either incident, when you're the PM, when you're someone else in public life commenting on it as we are, it's important to be consistent in terms of the principles of why you're saying what you're saying.
All right, let's just back to the interview with Angus Taylor there on tax reform. Tom, did you get a clearer sense at all of where they're likely to go now with tax?
Not really. No one likes to play the rule in, rule out game. We got very close to a couple of rule outs there, David. I think it just speaks to the fact again that I guess we are in a political climate where neither party wants to go anywhere near any policy prescription that is unpopular for anyone. And I think that that's an unfortunate position.
This is the problem with tax reform, though. You've got to have losers, don't you?
Well, you do. And I think this is the thing where I think both on tax and on spending, you've got to go back such a long time before you had political leaders who were willing to take something really unpopular and say, this is why I think it's right. And yes, you are the losers, but here's why I'm going to convince you that you should be. And I think that, again, if we go to a problem where we have a shrinking tax base and growing demands on the budget, it's simply not a problem that can be fixed until one or other side of politics is willing to be a little bit more, kind of clear about losers, and that's true on both sides. So when you have the coalition talking about lower taxes, the government talking about tax cuts for everyone, the government also talking about trimming $70 billion out of the NDIS, apparently without any disruption to anyone's plans. You can't keep promising that all of these things are going to be painless. They're not. And I think when we are in a climate where we do play this rule in, rule out game, we do sensationalise and seize on anything that sounds like a policy.
Just to be clear, I think the issue here is the coalition have been demanding all these rule outs from the government, right? So
yeah, and they don't want to play it themselves.
But they don't want to.
Well, a problem with the conversation around tax as well is it's never had holistically, and as much as there haven't been, brave leaders doing brave things, maybe in the broader sense, in recent years we had both the Coalition and then Labor say they were going to end Lamido. I know the Coalition liked to pretend it would have magically continued under them, but they both took to the budgets that it wouldn't. We had Jim Chalmers ending the freeze on the fuel excise, which obviously made everyone's petrol price start shooting up overnight. There have been individual decisions that both sides of politics in recent years have made that have made things more expensive for Australians. They've had that conversation with them. The issue now is obviously, I think, the timing of the political cycle gearing up to potentially the last big budget before even an election, even if it's early next year. So I think it's more about timing around going to the electorate rather than willingness to have difficult conversations.
Let's talk about the industrial relations changes, the latest batch that went through the Senate. There's a little bit that needs fixing up in both chambers next week. We can come to that. But Jacob, just explain to us what's in this latest package. What changes in the workplace as a result of this?
Well, the big change is this right to disconnect issue, which seems to have come out of nowhere from what I can tell. It wasn't something that I was reading about.
Came from the Greens.
Well, I mean, in terms of the build-up to it, yes, it came from the Greens. But I mean, I wasn't reading a lot of newspaper stories about the outrageous abuse of workers by their bosses ringing them up. So we've got this very strange thing that I think some of the younger panellists here might disagree with me. Maybe that's a generational thing. The problem is it is gumming up relationships between workers and employees at a time when we should be heading probably in the other direction. And some employers are sort of saying, well, fine, I can't ring you after 6 p.m, but maybe I'll put a ban on you going to the bathroom for half an hour to sit on Facebook. You know, they're probably just as justified.
As someone who carries my work in my phone and have always done since I was an adult, I can completely understand where there was a push for a principled stance on what is and isn't acceptable time. I mean, for hundreds of years there have been conversations about the 8-hour day and 5 days a week. This is really the new frontier of that. And I think its biggest problem is it did not have the lead in. I don't know that it would have necessarily had the build-up of people bringing egregious cases. I mean, they couldn't before the Fair Work or anything else. But I don't think that this is totally an unrealised issue among a lot of workers. The problem entirely is in how it came about. And even the fact that the Greens managed to include a criminal penalty in the amendment that went through.
So this is the bit they still need to fix, right?
This is the bit they need to fix.
And they will be able to fix it, you would assume. But
that was slightly born of the fact that the amendment wasn't circulated publicly. If it had been circulated at the time that the Greens brought it to the table, someone somewhere would have gone, oh, hang on a second, bosses can go to jail.
The big question here is, do we need this in law that you can switch off without being punished after hours? Can't this be worked out in workplace?
But clearly, it's not being.
Yeah, I think the reality of putting it in law is that it'll eventually filter through into agreements, and it'll just be a slightly more formalised arrangement.
So it'll mean the unions will make a claim for an availability allowance for their.
That's right.
Right, for workers.
And look, I think without getting involved too much in a generational war, I think that it all comes back to the conversation about productivity, obviously, with all these industrial relations changes. And I think business groups can fairly argue that any additional complexity can hurt productivity by, creating more red tape and more barriers for them to work through to do what they want to do. But I think that the productivity conversation, as this reveals, is multifaceted and a little bit more complex. Like we're used to, talking about productivity in agriculture or in a factory, you sort of know what it looks like. You get a new machine that does things quicker, it's more efficient, more productivity. What exactly productivity looks like in information jobs and in service jobs, I think is a question that the whole world is grappling with and is part of why we've had this low productivity over a period of time. And I think it's fair on the one hand for businesses to say, well, red tape gets in our way. But I think partly what a lot of young workers are saying is, I need to be a fully fledged person. I need to be able to switch off from work to be able to be fully productive at my information job. I need to have a life outside of work, and they would say that might enhance their productivity for the hours they're on.
Politicians do get a lot of after-hours contact as well. David Littleproud was asked about this by the ABC's Steffi Boris.
I think there's this thing called common sense, and I think employers and employees use that pretty well. And I think the less that government's in our lives, the better.
Are you conscious when you call your staff out of hours?
It's mainly because of you. And it's normally my media advisor. So if you have a problem with it, you probably should leave me alone.
Fair cop, I guess.
Well,
fair cop.
I think it's important to note that we're not talking about people that within their salary package it's acknowledged they're going to work extra hours.
No, I think that's a fair point. The vehicle emissions standard. Now, again, this probably needs a bit of explaining. Tom, we're, along with Russia, the only developed countries that don't have one, well established in the US and Europe and so on. How do they work? What's going to change here?
So, as I understand it, and I know Jake is much more across this thing than anyone in the gallery, but my understanding is that it applies across a vehicle fleet for a particular manufacturer, that they will have an emissions cap that they are allowed to sell to the Australian market each year, and that will ratchet up between now and 2029 in order to achieve the sort of vehicle emissions targets that the government has set for the transport industry. It reflects this kind of slightly bits and pieces approach that we now have to climate policy, because an economy-wide carbon price has been, ruled out and died a horrible political death. So instead we have the government working its way around to different sectors of the economy. We had the large industrial emitters dealt with under the safeguard mechanism. Now we're going over to cars and saying this is how you'll contribute to the emissions reduction fight. So there are all these little spot fires, and each one of them, I think, could explode into something.
So
this looks like it.
What it basically means is the car makers, Toyota, Ford and so on, have to sell an increasing number of electric and low emissions vehicles to offset their utes and four-wheel drives they want to sell. Now, the government says it won't push up the prices, but clearly Peter Dutton is convinced it will.
It's a tax of thousands of dollars on a ute. Tradies are going to cop it, right between the eyes, and already they're doing it tough. And I don't understand why the Prime Minister is so far out of touch that to try and please Green voters in inner city seats, he's going to slug tradies in areas, in outer metropolitan areas around the country.
So, Jacob, that's the question. Will it push up the price of a Hilux or not?
Yeah, it has to. It's designed to do that because you're wanting people to go to something else. You're wanting to affect behavioural change. Now, do we need one? Most likely, yes. The question is around the speed of this thing, how fast it ratchets up, how far. We're a unique kind of market. We travel big distances, we've got terrible roads, we have large families.
Vehicle,
right, so there's all sorts of issues like that.
Yeah.
In my view, this is politically the riskiest climate policy this government has pursued so far. Some of the things like safeguard mechanism changes, that's pretty hard to get your head around. Every Australian understands
the cost of a ute
or their vehicle they're driving if they need a 7-seater. And so the car makers are saying, look, we're not going to be able to respond in that timeline for the vehicles that Australians want. And that's the risk from this policy, and there are certainly people inside Labor, old hands, who are very, very nervous about this.
Claire?
Yeah, the government's preferred model, assuming they get something in by next year, is to ratchet it up by 60% to the end of the decade, which obviously the sector doesn't want. But I went to the department for more information about what made them so confident that the prices wouldn't go up, and they pointed to overseas cases, overseas markets where the car company has such a good market share that they don't want to risk losing that to a competitor, so they cop the price. Unfortunately, in those scenarios in Europe, America, other places, those manufacturers could dump all of their inefficient cars in markets like Australia. We're the last ones now, apart from Russia. So there isn't anywhere else for a manufacturer to offset complying with emissions requirements in other markets.
And you have big subsidies in the US. And just the last little thing that's very hard to get your head around on this, we're going to match the United States sort of standard on these emissions. Now, anyone who's spent 30 seconds in the United States knows there's more big cars in that part of the world than anywhere else. Like, those roads are chockers full of the very utes and trucks, as they call them, that this policy is supposed to reduce.
Speaking of the United States, we are keeping a bit of an eye on the presidential race this year, election year in the United States. And there was a pivotal moment on Friday when you had this special counsel report from the Justice Department with some pretty worrying findings about Joe Biden and his classified documents that he had at home in that period after he was vice president. Look, it said the president wouldn't be charged, but in part that's because his age and memory, let me quote from the report, at trial, Mr Biden would likely present himself to a jury, as he did during our interview, as a sympathetic, well-meaning elderly man with a poor memory. Well, the president responded pretty angrily to that.
How bad is your memory, and can you continue as president?
My memory is so bad I let you speak. That's
your memory has gotten worse, Mr. President?
My memory is not good. My memory is fine. Initially, the president of Mexico, Sisi, did not want to open up the gate to allow humanitarian material to get in.
So he confused Egypt with Mexico. Look, he's made this sort of name, muddles up names. He's done this for many years. Donald Trump too has muddled up a few names recently and details. But it's that finding in the report, Jacob, isn't it, that's a really hard one to shake.
Yeah, and it's like, I think, you know, people who haven't been paying attention to the United States, seeing that press conference at the end of last week was quite shocking, seeing the, you know, man calls press conference to demonstrate he's on top of things, makes a bunch of mistakes. You know, you couldn't have scripted a worse outcome.
Is there serious talk about moving him out and putting in another candidate for the Democrats?
Look, at this stage, it would hinge very much on Biden himself, and someone who's spent 70 years trying to become president's not going to give it up. You know, the personality is going to be a problem. Yeah, and they could switch to someone else before the convention, that's possible, but it would have to be driven by Biden.
And he said himself in that address that he's the best person to be president.
Well, that's his argument. They want a repeat of 2020 with the Trump v Biden because they've run that race before and they know they can win it.
Look, we've only got a minute or so left. I did just want to mention, though, this rather shocking sentence for the Australian writer Young Heng Jun that we heard about during the week. A suspended death sentence, so he remains locked up the next 2 years. If he doesn't do anything else wrong, it'll become a life sentence. The Foreign Minister Penny Wong said she was appalled at this. The Chinese ambassador was called into the department for a bit of a dressing down. What does this tell us, Claire, about the relationship between China and Australia now?
Well, there are some people, there's been some discussion about this isn't strictly a reflection of the Australia-China relationship, that this was a really big message that the security agencies in the ministry in China wanted to send to Chinese people and the Chinese diaspora who might do things like be pro-democracy as writers, as Dr. Young was. So that is sort of speaks a little bit to the extremity of the sentencing. But it is a huge diplomatic issue for Australia now. We are obviously always against the death penalty, but in this particular case, it makes any kind of further stabilisation of relationships very complicated. This issue will now be at the centre of every meeting between a Chinese and Australian official indefinitely.
Well, it's a reality check, isn't it? That despite the red carpets and so on, there are still some real difficulties there. Look, I understand, there's still a plan for the Chinese Premier Li to visit Australia. Australia's not going to be suggesting that be called off, but a difficult moment in the relationship, no doubt. All right, our panel, Tom Crowley, Claire Armstrong and Jacob Grieber, will be back very shortly with some final observations. Time now, though, for Mike Bowers and Talking Pictures.
I'm Mike Bowers and I'm a photographer at large for The Guardian Australia. I'm talking pictures this morning with photographer for the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age, the one and only Alex Ellinghausen, and a very warm welcome.
Good morning, Mike. Thanks for having me back.
And a new year, mate. I know. There was a real sort of first day of school energy about the building all this week.
I know, it always is on the first day. There's a lot of stuff that happens and it's all at the same time.
Yeah. I think Mark Knight captured that perfectly in this. He's got the Prime Minister and the Treasurer here sort of very, very happy with the tax cut apple in here. Now that we agree on tax cuts, let's hold hands and skip in.
That's never going to happen.
Yeah.
Can you imagine that ride?
Yeah, be great, wouldn't it? I wonder who sits on the back seat. Have you ever noticed that when the Treasurer smiles, his ears come forward?
It's not something I've picked up, Mike.
The traditional ecumenical service generally starts the new year, and in the sermon they were reminded that they weren't gods, which I thought was helpful because some of them do think they can walk on water. This is one of the days that your least favourite days of the year. Why is that?
There's always a lot going on. You're slightly not match fit. You're getting used to coming back to the...
Slightly. I'm completely not match fit.
But then you get through the first week and then the year just kind of...
It rolls on. Yeah. Lots of politicians had their kids.
Yep.
And Annika Wells, one of the twins, Ossian, was here. I think he was expressing all our feelings here at the UN Women's Breakfast.
Oh, that was mid-press conference. You can't blame him.
No, I know, right? There was a spring in the step of the government, the stage 3 tax cuts.
I think they kind of expected, they knew they're going to get attacked politically for the broken promise. But at the same time, they're hoping that people will receive this tax cut well.
And certainly the Prime Minister's performance was spirited, let's say.
Yeah, look, I think last year ended on a tough note for them, so they'll be looking forward to starting this year on a good note.
Yep. This is one of your photos here. This expresses it beautifully.
Oh, look, I think they're pleased with the way things have gone this week. They're happy.
Yeah, they're very happy. The Prime Minister and the Treasurer and the government looked pretty happy, had their tails up, but the opposition leader's mood had decisively changed from that of last year.
Not only is it first week back at Parliament, but, you know, nobody likes getting wedged.
He was an atomic wedgie. David Rowe has picked up the 3 stages of Dutton. He's got figure 1, he's walking here with the thug, thug, shimmy, thug, thug. It's like...
with a pretty spectacular flip here as well, and a smile through the legs.
I didn't see much of the evidence of smile.
Oh, look, I think, you know, not only did they get wedged this week, there's all this material from that new ABC documentary Nemesis that's come out.
It was quite tumultuous few years.
How do you feel when you relive some of those really busy, stressful moments?
Triggered. When you're around politics long enough, there's this cyclical pattern that happens and it goes full circle.
Yeah, like, I mean, they were there when Killing Season was made. And I remember when Killing Season was made.
They took great joy, right?
Yeah, they were mentioning it now with the shoes on the other foot.
These things come around. And certainly this photo here of Jane Hume, she doesn't look overly happy.
Oh, look, I think this was the press conference where they had to come out and state their position on stage 3, and I don't think that was something that they really wanted to be doing this week.
and Angus Taylor?
Slightly uncomfortable.
A very historic visit this week, Alex. The Prime Minister of Papua New Guinea, James Marape, addressed a special joint sitting. These are very big deals when both houses come together to listen to an address from a foreign leader.
The first one by a leader of a Pacific nation as well.
It has been a long week and I want to thank you very much for unpicking the events. I'll let you do the honours.
Thanks for having me, Mike, and back to you, David.
Thank you, Alex. Thank you, Mike. Let's get some final observations. Tom.
Well, the government, there's been a lot of talk about doing politics differently in the last couple of weeks. One element of that, when the government said that, was cleaning up the bipartisan process of jobs for mates. I'm not sure that they've got a great report card on that front at the moment. There's a growing list of former cabinet ministers, former union staffers, Labor staffers who've gotten jobs. And now, in the 9 papers this morning, there are some concerns from the crossbench that Mark Dreyfus's replacement for the AAT, which was abolished because of concerns about politicisation, may not have fixed the minister's role in the appointments process. I think that's one to watch.
Funny how that happens. Claire.
This week it's the anniversary of the apology to the stolen generation. There'll be a lot of ceremony and speech around that. I think quite timely of the Productivity Commission's report last week saying that closing the gap will fail without fundamental change. So while you're watching all of the beautiful ceremony and commemoration this week, it might be worth writing to a local member and asking what they're doing about closing the gap.
Yes, I understand there will be announcements on Tuesday when they table the latest report around real work rather than some of the CDP jobs in Indigenous communities. Jacob.
My colleague at the Financial Review, Andrew Tillett, I think broke a very big and important story this week about the terrible relationship, it seems, between Labor and the Defence Department. I think this is a massive issue. We have a Defence Department whose budget has gone from $26 billion a decade ago to over 50, with a lot of spending to do and a lot of questions to be answered, I think, about how they're prioritising their spending. Are we getting, are we getting value for money, or is this just a behemoth that no one can manage?
And Richard Marles apparently not very happy with the spelling mistakes in the briefs that he's getting from Defence.
The least of his problems.
There are layers of concern. Thank you all very much for joining us this morning. Finally, We know politicians can dial up the outrage to make a point or grab a headline. Bob Katter's pretty good at going from 0 to 100 in the middle of a sentence. But as Jackie Lambie showed, it's also possible to quickly shift in the other direction. We'll leave you with that. Thanks for watching.
Every bit of work that you think you've done for every woman in Australia has just gone down the gurgler. You are full of it. Absolutely full of it. Jen, would you like to say something?
You're making us all feel very excited about being here.